Hi folks, in this video I discuss Beauvoir's piece Pyrrus and Cineas. What I want you to do is figure out if you can understand what exactly Beauvoir's view of these two characters is. Does she side with Pyrrus or Cineas or both of them? How does she actually use this dialogue in order to articulate her philosophy? So pause your videos now and see if you can decide for yourselves what you think she thinks of them. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. I actually think she sides with Pyrrhus and not Cineas, although I think this can easily be confusing. This is complicated because at one point, she says Cineas seems wise. But remember, philosophers do this all the time. They always articulate the opposing point of view and try to do so with great charity because that makes it more convincing when they then tear it down. Or sometimes maybe just philosophers like to sit on the fence like Chidi, who was berated by Michael for being wishy-washy in his 3,000-page dissertation. But this just illustrates the fact that you can't necessarily trust when somebody says something like Cineas seems wise that Beauvoir really thinks that is the ultimate view. I think she disagrees with Cineas. It's not like Cineas doesn't have anything right, but fundamentally Cineas has a deeply problematic existential position. Let's remind ourselves what this dialogue and dispute is supposed to be about. So Pyrrhus was, an ancient king who wanted to go on conquest and say, I'm going to conquer all of Greece. And then Cineas says, but what then? And Pyrrhus says, oh, I'll conquer all of Africa. And then what then? Cineas is like the annoying kid who keeps asking, what then? What then? And then he says, I'll conquer all of Asia. And finally, Pyrrhus runs out of, his imagination is filled. He runs out of ideas and says, okay, then I'll just kick back and rest because I've conquered the world. And Cineas says, well, then if you're just going to kick back and rest after all that effort, you can do that now. What's wrong? And this is this raises deep existential questions. And I really like that Beauvoir uses this story to articulate her position. Why, if you can do the thing that you would do at the end of all of that journey, then why are you bothering to even do it? Why pursue any goals whatsoever if it doesn't really make an ultimate difference? Why, or as Beauvoir articulates versions of this question throughout the piece, why cry for others? What binds you to them? Or why cultivate your garden? What is your garden in the first place? And if that is your garden, why bother cultivating it? Why do we waste all our time and effort on all of these projects if ultimately we know it's going to come to nothing? We know that in several billion years, our star is going to become it's going to, expand and become a giant star. It's going to swallow up the earth. Everything is going to be for naught. We are just little ants on one little speck of dust in the middle of the universe, which will soon be gone. How does it have how can we motivate ourselves? How is any meaning possible? How can we create any meaning in our lives? So I think the perspective, if we think really about what Cineas is saying, sure, he does seem wise. It does seem just like Ivan seems wise in the Brothers Karamazov. It seems smart to be, the cool intellectual nihilist who sees through all the meaninglessness of reality. But that doesn't mean that we should endorse it. And that doesn't mean that Beauvoir endorses it. Because I think what's behind this from an existential point of view in Cineas's reasoning is the idea that his insight is there are no absolute goals or absolute meaning. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's all just meaninglessness. But that doesn't mean we should be like Rick in Rick and Morty, the animated show. That doesn't mean, you see, Cineas's inference is that there are no goals and meaning at all. That's Rick's inference too. That doesn't mean we should be like that. Beauvoir doesn't want us to be like that, even though human projects seem absurd. And maybe Beauvoir even thinks from some perspective they are absurd. But that doesn't mean we should abandon all meaning in life. And in fact, what Beauvoir's project is all about, her philosophical contribution, is to articulate ways in which we actually do create meaning. And I've said in other videos how she's like Nietzsche in many ways, and I realize that can be puzzling because the selections that I've given you are ones in which she actually takes issue with a lot of Nietzschean style positions because I wanted to highlight those differences. But I think she is in the same business as Nietzsche in the sense that they are both deeply atheistic, naturalistic philosophers who recognize that there is not that there is not absolute meaning from some beyond supernatural power or religious source, and so we have to become creators of meaning. But her resources for us to become creators of meaning is going to be quite different than Nietzsche's. For one thing, it's interesting to think about how different her perspective was just when you think about the timeline. I've talked about the important historical context of all existentialist philosophers. So that's why I keep going back to these dates so that you really can understand the relative connections between these folks. That Kierkegaard was a full generation earlier. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were similar by the end of their lives, similar ages, although Dostoevsky was still older. And there's a big gap between them and Beauvoir, not least of which there has been 2 world wars, which seemed absolutely devastating. They were absolutely devastating. They were, given the machinery, the mass means of destruction, not just, the tanks, the airplanes, the machine guns, and of course then the atomic bomb, the ways in which humanity had invented technological means at total annihilation. And which led to, those sophisticated means led to them simply becoming worse and worse, torturing, destroying people on a grander scale than had ever been seen in history. That is the perspective from what Beauvoir is writing. And clearly, life can seem absurd from that perspective. When people can just act like monsters and do absolutely horrific things. How can we understand there are ties that bind us together universally if we are going to just be atheists and not assume it's some supernatural God that's somehow going to do it or make everything right in the afterworld in the face of such global atrocities? That it's really key to see how different a perspective Beauvoir is working from in her historical context compared to someone like Nietzsche. Now, so I said Beauvoir's goal is to see how we can create meaning. She's going to rehabilitate this idea that there actually are ends and goals and purposes. She writes a lot in her philosophical work about projects and what it means for humans to engage in projects. So this is the sense in which I really do think she disagrees with Cineas. There's an important distinction that's helpful here between instrumental and intrinsic goals. This, of course, telos, you've seen this before when we were talking about Kierkegaard's teleological suspension of the ethical. If you learn no other words in this class, maybe you'll remember the word, you'll increase your repertoire of ancient Greek by adding the word telos into your vocabulary. Philosophers have been writing about teloses for a long time. Aristotle had this really important distinction that has become well entrenched and very useful between instrumental and intrinsic teloses or goals. Instrumental ones are things that you do just because you want something else. Like maybe your reason for doing well in high school was because you just wanted to get into a good college and you didn't care about how well you did on that calculus test or that French test. You just cared about getting a good, you didn't care about learning anything. There's nothing intrinsically important about that experience. You just wanted to get into UW or into some school or other. So that would, then studying for that test or doing well in high school was just instrumentally valuable for you. Whereas if you're doing something for its own right, not merely because it serves some other goal, but because it has something worthwhile within it, internal to that activity itself is something valuable, then that is an intrinsic purpose or an intrinsic goal. Now, many things can be both. You maybe were doing well in high school because you did want to get into a good college, and you also thoroughly enjoyed learning. So these are not mutually exclusive. But Aristotle thought, and many people think, that there's a way in which intrinsic goals are really key. Not everything can be instrumentally valuable because this would create this infinite regress. There has to be something that is intrinsically valuable for anything to be valuable, period. And it's difficult to see how that could be in a godless, absurd universe. So this is a way in which you can really motivate Cineas's kind of perspective. Let me say, Aristotle's view was that happiness was the intrinsically valuable thing. So, maybe you wanted to do well in school so you could get into a good college, but you only wanted to get into a good college so you could get a good job. You only wanted to get a good job so you could make lots of money, but money's not really intrinsically valuable. It's only valuable instrumentally because it helps us do other things that we want to do in life. Well, this is like Cineas's regress. What do you want to do in life then? Why are you doing all of these things? What are you going to do with your money? Just make more money, like invest it in stocks so you can just have more and more money? That would be like worshiping money as something intrinsically valuable. Now, if all you want to do for making all that money is just, kick back so you can have a day off, well, Cineas will tell you, you can have a day off now. Just don't bother getting a job. Beauvoir does not, now I'm like being devil's advocate, Beauvoir doesn't want us to endorse that perspective. What she thinks is we should be more like Pyrrhus. And she has another, character or metaphor for this, the child. And what's interesting is Nietzsche actually writes about the value of children. Dostoevsky writes about the value of children. In many ways, the way in which children can find meaning in their lives and not be worried about existential angst and depression and despair is something that has inspired a lot of existential philosophers. Now, how can we do that without merely regressing to a lower form of a previous stage of development? Is sort of an interesting question, sort of like Kierkegaard's question between how do we avoid, when we care about the particularity of the finite world, avoid regressing down into the aesthetic, but actually transcend it to higher immediacy. Well, Beauvoir says what's beautiful about children in their play is that they are autotelic. They have their ends within themselves. And auto just means yourself, like automobile has a self-propelled motion. Well, autotelic activities are those things that are intrinsically valuable, that need no other external justification. And so she says things like, as a child, think about the children, how they can run and play and they don't bother asking themselves questions. Pyrrhus is like that before his advisor Cineas starts badgering him. That's the way we should be. We want to carry within ourselves our own reasons for being. We don't need the supports of other things in order to justify us. We don't need entirely external justifications. We need to be able to be meaning creators. And of course, the way we do that is by embracing our freedom and responsibility. And interestingly, for Beauvoir, that means connections with others. And this is the way in which she really does deeply depart from Nietzsche. Because the important thing about goals and telos here is we can't just decide not to have any of these things. We can't decide not to pursue any projects. Beauvoir thinks what it is to be a human is to be a subject, to have subjectivity, to be an agent with plans, with goals. We have to make decisions. That is the ineliminable aspect of humanity, is you have to make decisions. And even not deciding is still some sort of decision. You're just doing a bad job at being a decision maker and fleeing in bad faith from the freedom that you have to make those decisions and the responsibilities that involves. Okay, so this is a little bit about what I think really the ultimate point of the Pyrrhus and Cineas story is. I think Pyrrhus is the hero and Cineas is the villain. So I'll just add Cineas to my list of Beauvoirian characters. I think she really heavily criticizes in the Ethics of Ambiguity the passionate person, and in both works, in Pyrrhus and Cineas and the Ethics of Ambiguity, we see her talking about Camus' Stranger. And I think Cineas is in the same ballpark. People with deeply problematic existential perspectives. And in contrast to this, as I've said before, I think her real paradigm or hero is the person who fights for liberation, both for themselves and for others. Okay, thanks.